with great consideration and respect, both for the other person and for oneself. Love is the highest experience that we human beings can have, and it can add depth and meaning to our lives.
Imagine a different world, a world of full equality for lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, and transgender people. A world where everyone has the same rights in housing, jobs, public accommodations, and equal access to government benefits, equal protection of the law, etc., etc. That is not the world that Joanne Richie and Sharon Reed found themselves in on the night of September 3rd, 2005, at the University of Washington Medical Center in Seattle, Washington. Sharon, a psychotherapist, and Joanne, a City of Seattle housing administrator, had been life partners for 17 years when Joanne's chronic illness worsened and she was hospitalized at the University of Washington Medical Center. Over the years, Sharon had been very much involved in Joanne's medical care. Joanne had executed a broad power of attorney regarding health care, which was contained in the official medical records of the hospital, expressly directing that Sharon was to have access to Joanne and that Joanne wished to have the solace and the companionship of her life partner. On September 3rd, 2005, Joanne was moved to the ICU and came under the care of a contract nurse, Sharon Hulley, for the evening. And on that night, their lives changed forever. Despite the fact that the University and JoAnn's doctor permitted Sharon to be by her bedside constantly, Nurse Hulley repeatedly refused Sharon access to JoAnn's room and bedside, continually evicting her from the room. By the time Sharon regained access to her partner the next morning, Joanne's condition had deteriorated and she was heavily drugged. She died within a matter of hours. The Insider Exclusive now goes behind the headlines to visit with Sharon Reed and her lawyer, Judith Lonnquist, as they relive the long night from hell as Sharon watched, from a distance, the love of her life, Joanne, slowly dying alone, all because of the cruelty and the insensitivity of the nurse from hell, Sharon Hulley. Judith will explain the justifiable reasons behind their lawsuit that they have filed against Nurse Hulley and her employer, which the courts have refused to dismiss both at the trial and the appellate court levels, and is scheduled for trial in April 2010. Hi, I'm Steve Murphy, and this is the Insider Exclusive, live from Seattle, Washington, at the law offices of Judith Lonnquist. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Judith Lonnquist, the lawyer for Sharon Reed. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
This is a very interesting case. It's an unusual case. Tell us a little bit about the facts behind this case.
Well, the real advantage of being a civil rights lawyer is you get to take on cases that are unusual, and because they need justice, some justice has to be done. And when Sharon came into my office and told me the story of what happened to her, I thought, this is a case that I have got to pursue. Mm-hmm. She and her partner, Joe, had been in a long-term committed relationship, and Joe was ill. And they knew that her illness would require hospitalization. And so they went to some of the finest lawyers here in the state of Washington to prepare all the kinds of paperwork that they needed to make sure that Joe would be able to have access to Sharon and vice versa. Right. And so they had powers of attorney, they had medical directives. Joe was the executor of Sharon was the executor of Joe's estate. And then it came to pass that Joe became very ill and went into the University of Washington Medical Center, which is a big teaching hospital here in Seattle. And eventually they said she had to go into intensive care, and things were looking very bad for Joe. And as they were wheeling her down to intensive care, she said to Sharon, "I'm scared, please don't leave me alone." And Sharon assured her that she would be with her that evening, Sharon and Joe's sister Betsy Hanson, who is a nurse, were talking to the doctor, and he...
It gives me great pleasure to introduce Judith Lonnquist, the lawyer for Sharon Reed. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
This is a very interesting case, isn't it? It's an unusual case. Tell us a little bit about the facts behind this case.
Well, the real advantage of being a civil rights lawyer is you get to take on cases that are unusual, and because they need justice, some justice has to be done. And when Sharon came into my office and told me the story of what happened to her, I thought, this is a case that I have got to pursue. She and her partner, Joe, had been in a long-term committed relationship, and Joe was ill. And they knew that her illness would require hospitalization. And so they went to some of the finest lawyers here in the state of Washington to prepare all the kinds of paperwork that they needed to make sure that Joe would be able to have access to Sharon and vice versa. Right. And so they had powers of attorney, they had medical directives. Joe was the executor of Joe's, or Sharon was the executor of Joe's estate. And then it came to pass that Joe became very ill and went into the University of Washington Medical Center, which is a big teaching hospital here in Seattle. Right. And eventually they said she had to go into intensive care, and things were looking very bad for Joe. And as they were wheeling her down to intensive care...
In fact, in the legal terminology, this is actually what's called a tort of outrage,
assured
isn't
her
it?
that she would be with
Define
her.
that for our audience.
That evening, Sharon and Joe's sister Betsy Hanson, who is a nurse, were talking to the doctor, and he said, look, you know, Joe's condition is dire, but we expect her to make it through the night, so why doesn't one of you go home and get rest? So
right. What are some of the, you know, when we talk about emotional distress, okay? Anyone can imagine if you're very close to someone, and JoAnn, Joe, and Sharon were together for 17 years. They have a long-term relationship, and as much as they could have, as much to the extent as possible, they had all the documents necessary to show that they were a significant partners, right? What did the hospital say about all of this, by the way?
And told me that story. I was so outraged that I thought that this is a case I have got to take. And so that's how it came to pass.
In fact, in the legal terminology, this is actually what's called a tort of outrage.
Correct, it is.
Define that for our audience.
Well, a tort of outrage is a situation in which someone who has a duty of care towards another person inflicts severe emotional distress upon that person to the extent that the ordinary citizen would say, that's outrageous.
Right. And give me some other examples of cases like that.
There's a case in Washington in which the funeral home dropped the casket in front of the grieving widow, and the corpse of her husband fell out. That was a tort of outrage.
Yes.
There are not many, Steve, because it's a very seldom used cause of action.
Okay, but you use it, obviously, I mean, you file a lawsuit, obviously.
Right.
We are going to go right now to a video deposition that was taken of Betsy Hanson, and Betsy was the sister of JoAnn, correct?
Okay.
And Betsy was an RN.
Anyone can imagine.
And unfortunately, Betsy can't be with us today because she passed away, right? But we're going to go to that deposition right now where she talks about that night and what actually happened. So let's do that now.
Now, you've previously testified to a conversation that Sharon and Dr. Turk had the following morning, in which Dr. Turk asked Ms. Reed why she was upset, sobbing. Were you present for that discussion?
I was present that morning.
Okay. And what do you recall the conversation to have been?
Objection, hearsay.
When it was just as the shift was coming on, and for the morning shift, and Dr. Turk walked by, and the waiting room is visible right by the double doors going to ICU, and he saw Sharon sobbing. And he said, what's the problem? What's wrong, Sharon? And she said, I haven't been able to be in with JoAnn all night. And he said, I believe, to the best of my recollection, he said, why? And she said, the nurse wouldn't let me in. And he said, I'll take care of it.
Sharon and JoAnn were extremely close, and obviously her sister knew this quite well. And we have another deposition that was taken to testify this. Let's go to that right now.
Have you ever observed Ms. Reed's presence having a negative impact on your sister's state or condition?
Objection, lacks foundation.
Never, just the opposite.
Okay.
Always a benefit.
When would you describe that for the record, please?
A description of I saw many times with my sister and Sharon, her of many years, 17 years partner. Always, Sharon was a great comfort to my sister. My sister always wanted Sharon, or if not Sharon, myself with her. One example is when there was a situation on the floor where many doctors came into the room, and in that incredible chaos, and she was in respiratory distress, Sharon was allowed to be up by her ear. And with not only the fact that Sharon was her partner and her loved one, with her sort of therapeutic way that she would talk skillfully to her to help calm her down, to explain that what was going on in the room, that they could ignore, we're right here with you. She would also use the wonderful phrase that my sister loved to hear, which was faith, not fear.
Fortunately, we do have Sharon today, so we're going to bring her on right now. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Sharon Reed. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Read so much about you. Judith was nice enough to send me a little bio of your background. Tell us a little bit about you.
I grew up in California. I had one sibling, older brother, and our family was very. I grew up in California. I had one sibling, older brother, and our family was very. I wouldn't call it religious as much as spiritual. Although we attended church and Sunday school and Bible classes and all the time I was growing up. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do until I started working in my junior year at a residential treatment center for emotionally disturbed kids. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do until I started working in my junior year.
How did you end up meeting JoAnn?
We met at a gay pride event, which is the name of an organization back then. We met at a gay pride event, which is the name of an organization back then that was involved in working civil rights for gay people. And we knew each other for about 8 years before we, 8 or 9 years before we actually got together.
Once you got together, you were together for what, 17 long years, right? Tell us a little bit about that. Once you got together, you were together for what, 17 long years, right?
Yes. Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it was just the happiest time of my life. Joe and I both felt like we had met the love of our lives. And by that time, I had adopted a son with another woman, and that relationship changed. And I continued to co-parent my son. And so Joe became a third mom to Mark, my son. And I had a thriving private practice in psychology, and Joe was working for the city.
Let's go back to September 3rd, 2005. Joe was taken to the hospital.
Families and friends.
Let's go back to September 3rd, 2005. Joe was taken to the hospital.
She was admitted to the hospital about 4 or 5 days before September 3rd. September 3rd was a Saturday, and her condition began to worsen. And they were worried about her not getting enough oxygen to her lungs. And we had been in the hospital. She had been in the hospital over and over again because she had a blood disease that was diagnosed when she was 28. And she...
Same hospital, right? This is the University of Washington Medical Center?
So
Okay.
We weren't strangers to the hospital or to the
Same
doctors.
hospital, right?
Yes.
This is the University of Washington. Yeah,
Yes.
Okay. You were prepared too, because as Judith brought up, you had all the documents you needed.
Just to...
Yeah, medical directives, the whole 9 yards. The staff knew you at the hospital, didn't it?
Judith brought up,
Okay.
you had all...
What changed that night?
Well, that night, Joe was... Betsy, her sister, was with me before...
What changed that night?
Well, that night, Joe was... Betsy, her sister, was with me before... right after Joe was admitted to the ICU. And the doctor told us that her condition was very dire. And he said he was hopeful that she would live till the morning. But he didn't know. And he suggested that one of us go home and get some rest, because we had been with Joe in the hospital all week, off and on, Betsy and I. And so Betsy went home to rest. And I asked him that night if I could be in Joe's room with her. And he said he didn't see any reason why not. He said, of course. He said, I don't think that's a problem. And so he left the ICU, and I went to Joe's room and went in, and I had been there about 10 minutes, and the nurse, Joe's nurse, said I had to leave.
And that was Nurse Hulley, wasn't
And
it?
I asked...
Tell us about Nurse Hulley.
Well, as the night progressed,
Tell us about Nurse Hulley.
Well, as the night progressed, I kept trying to get into...
What did she say to you?
Going to the door, and she became more and more irritated with me and angry and hostile
What
towards
did
me.
she say to you?
She, at one point, I went to the door and she said, "You get out of here. You don't belong here." And I said, "But our papers are all in Joe's medical records. The doctor said I could be with Joe. What is the problem?"
Yeah.
I said, "I'll sit in the corner and be quiet. I just need to be with Joe during this time. I've always been with her when she was in the hospital." And she said, "You don't belong here. It doesn't matter what you're saying." And I would leave, and then I would just be frantic that Joe would die. And so then I would go back and try to go in the room, and periodically she would not be in the room. And so on 2 occasions I was able to go in and talk very quietly to Joe and touch her hand and let her know that I was there. And on one of those occasions, the nurse came...
What do you think she meant by, "You don't belong there"?
"Get out of the room. You don't belong there," she said. And I said, "I do belong here."
What do you think she meant by, "You don't belong there"?
I don't know what she meant. I frankly can't imagine telling any close relative or...
So you were at a you weren't with her during her last hours of life.
I can't imagine doing that.
So you were at a you weren't with her during her last hours of life?
No, I wasn't with her all night long. And she, she died the next morning. And when the shift changed the next morning, her doctor came past the waiting room where I was. And he and the charge nurse, whom I knew from other hospitalizations, came up to me and asked me, I'm sorry. They asked me why I was crying. And I told them that I hadn't been able to get into the room to be with Joe. And they were both upset about it. And within 20 minutes after the shift changed, and a new nurse was there, I was allowed to.
I'm sorry to hear that.
And she died just a few hours later. But I was never allowed to have any time alone.
I'm sorry to hear that.
And she spent the last night without me there. The other thing was that the night before, she had asked me to please stay with her. She said she was afraid. And I promised her that I would stay with her. And I couldn't keep that promise.
Right. Well, in a way, what you're doing now is kind of keeping your promise. How did you end up coming to Judith here?
Most of it.
Right. Well, in a way, what you're doing now is kind of keeping your promise. How did you end up coming to Judith here?
Well, I didn't come right away. I had Joe died in September, and sometime in January, I think it was, that I was talking to a friend about what had happened. And she happened to be a friend of Judith's. And she said, "Oh my God, you have to talk to Judith about this."
Yeah.
And so I came and just had a meeting with her to discuss.
Obviously, this was another outrage, wasn't it?
Been able to get into the room to be with Joe. And they were both upset about it. And within 20 minutes after the shift changed,
Yeah.
and a new nurse was there, I was allowed to be in the room.
You know, I keep coming back to what Nurse Hulley said. You don't belong here. What do you think she meant by that?
I'm sorry.
I think
She
that
spent
she's
the
homophobic,
last night
Yeah.
and that she
without me
was
there.
upset by the
The other
obvious
thing was that the
Mhm.
night before, she had
And that
asked
brings
me
us to
please
what's going
stay
on
with
in the
her.
state
She
of
said she was
Washington
afraid.
today
good things happen.
And I
regarding, and
promised
a
her
little bit of the history of, you know,
that I would
same-sex
stay with her.
marriages, partnerships, and that sort of thing. What's the difference? Because this is ongoing all throughout the country,
in spite of
where you
what I
have
told
some
the
states, I
nurse,
think there's
all
what,
my
5
efforts
states?
to
Iowa,
be
New
with her.
Hampshire,
So
Vermont, and Massachusetts, 4,
that was
maybe 4,
probably the worst
that
of it.
actually have laws on the books that allow people same-sex to get married,
How
correct?
did you?
But the federal government doesn't recognize it, does it?
No, as a matter of fact,
Well,
they passed a
way.
called DOMA, which prohibits
I had
Yeah.
gay people.
And DOMA stands for
Joe
what?
died in September,
Defensive marriage.
and
Defensive. Now,
she
yeah, when I
happened to
first
be
saw
friend
that, I
of
thought to
Judith's.
myself, wait a
And she
minute.
said, "Oh my God."
Why does legislation have to be passed
About
in
this.
defense of
And so I
something
came
that is not
just had a
really
meeting
a
with her to discuss it.
state-regulated
Yeah.
item,
And-
right?
And
And
why would love
you know the rest
Well,
immediately.
yeah,
Judith
well,
said,
Yeah.
"We have to do something."
Yeah.
Obviously, this is another outrage.
So tell us
It
what's
was
going on in
indeed.
the state of Washington
it
in regards
fits
to
the bill
you
perfectly,
know, same-sex
that
marriages,
any
partnerships, that
reasonable,
sort of thing.
compassionate person would say, that's just outrageous.
Yeah.
And that's the test for this kind of tort, this kind of claim.
You know, I keep coming back to what Nurse Hulley said. You don't belong here.
I think that she's homophobic.
That's in the state of Washington.
And that she was upset by the obvious love and caring between these two women.
And that brings us to what's going on in the state of Washington today.
Good things happening here.
Regarding, and a little bit of the history of, you know, same-sex marriages, partnerships, and that sort of thing. What's the difference? Because this is ongoing all throughout the country, where you have some states, I think there's, what, 5 states? Iowa, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts, 4, maybe 4,
Right.
that actually have laws on the books that allow people of same sex to get
Right.
married.
Do they have to itemize
But the federal
every
government
single
doesn't
thing in order for it to
No,
be
as a matter of
allowed?
fact, they passed, during the Bush administration, they passed a law called DOMA, which prohibits marriage between gay people.
And DOMA stands for what?
I knew you were going to ask me that.
I think it's
Domestic something Marriage Act.
Right.
Oh, Defense of Marriage Act, that's what it
Now,
is.
Yeah, when I first saw that, I thought to myself, why does legislation have to be passed in defense of something that is not really a state-regulated item, right?
And why would love between any two people be something that you'd
Yeah.
want to prohibit?
Yeah.
That's a mystery to me.
So tell us what's going on in the state of Washington here.
Well,
in regards to, same-sex marriages, partnerships, that sort of thing.
A number of years ago, we passed a domestic benefits law, which basically says that if you are employed and you are a lesbian, gay, transgendered person who
Your
chose not
practice
to
is
be
kind
married.
of dedicated to civil rights,
There was a
employment
group
law,
of
and that sort
people
thing,
in
isn't it?
Washington who were opposed to that, and they got enough signatures to put it on the ballot as a referendum to reverse that bill that the governor had
Right.
signed. On November 3rd, the voters of the state of Washington spoke very clearly that they did not want that law repealed,
Right.
and that they did want lesbian and gay people to have the same domestic rights that married couples do.
Right. Your practice.
I bet you a lot of
dedicated
news organizations and people are watching this case quite carefully, aren't they?
People, isn't it?
What was the response? I'm curious. Of
My
the nursing
practice really is
agency when you
employment
initially
law
sued them?
and employment discrimination. But as a part of employment
Yeah,
law,
but
I often
they
do
tried
have
to get the
intentional
case
infliction of
dismissed, didn't they?
emotional distress claims.
Stop. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to your practice because of the siren.
Oh, okay.
Right.
See, I
We
didn't,
can be 100 floors up in New York City, and you can hear that right outside your window.
see, I don't even hear it anymore.
It reminds me of a story.
Well, that's good.
I live
That's
you know,
good.
where I
Well,
live by
I'm
the
so
beach.
glad you
There's Elsa
were able to
down
be with us today, and we wish both of you, a lot of success in this. And thank you very much, and I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, and thank you very much.
Brand new
Judith.
house.
Thanks for watching. You can get more information about these shows, the guests, and the issues at www.insiderexclusive.tv. Thank you.